Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special economic weather report brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand. Today I want to have a look at New Zealand's GDP, our total output, and how much of it accrues to New Zealanders, our gross national income. Because there's a couple of different ways you can measure GDP, and they are quite interesting in that they show how much of our output is sent overseas in the form of interest payments on debt we owe offshore, or in profits and dividends that are paid to the foreign owners of assets here. So let's look first at how much of New Zealand's GDP is being exported each year and how it's changed over the last 20 to 30 years. Because obviously New Zealand has borrowed quite a bit offshore and we've sold quite a few assets over the last couple of decades. So what does that mean now in terms of the annual drain, if you like, on our economy from money being exported back to the owners, foreign owners of assets here? Well, this chart shows you what's happening to the share of GDP going to foreigners and how it's gone from about 1% in the early 1970s. It kept on falling, really fell sharply in the early 1980s when Robert Muldoon took on a lot of debt, bounced up a bit in the late 1980s and then fell away again as assets were sold, and then through the 2000s as we borrowed a lot against our houses through the banks, then it started to increase down to about 7% of GDP. When I say down, I mean up in terms of the size of that drain on the economy. Okay, now let's have a look at what's happened to GDP, the total output in New Zealand. So you can see that has actually been rising. That's the top line that continued rising for most of the period of the 1990s and 2000s. So the economy was growing. We were using new technology, we were exporting more in some cases, and we certainly were employing more people. So surely GDP was growing. Well, it did grow, but when you take into account the money that's been then sent offshore and the population growth we've been having, you can see here that GNI, gross national income per capita, actually peaked in 2003, almost 10 years ago, and it's been dropping pretty much ever since. So New Zealanders thought we were wealthier, that we thought that we were worth it, and we managed to use the money from borrowing offshore to spend more, essentially. Firstly, we did it through our houses, through borrowing against our houses offshore. That's where we went out and spent money on cars and flat screen TVs and the like, and putting new bits into our houses. And then in the last 2 to 3 years we've used the government to continue to kid ourselves that we're worth it. We're talking working for families, interest-free student loans and the like. So there we have it. This shows in real detail how New Zealand's gross national income per capita has been flat to falling since 2003, even though our GDP has been rising. That's because of increased population, and because there's now so much of a drain in our economy from foreign ownership of assets and debt. And finally, this chart here, which shows the difference between GDP per capita and GNI per capita. What that essentially abstracts out the effect of population gain. And you can see here, since about 2003, it's been expanding. As we've borrowed more offshore and sold more assets, we've had to pay back more offshore in dividends and interest payments. So what does this mean for policymakers? Well, if we want to stop a continual slide in our GNI per capita, we need to do a couple of things. We need to repay that debt, or at least stop it growing, and at the moment it's growing at a rate of almost $1 billion a week. Our government is borrowing, and we need to stop selling national assets. Now, to do that, we'd have to put up some pretty strong barriers or make sure that we save a lot ourselves. We have some real challenges ahead of us, and I'd like to ask the question, is our government up to it? I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special economic weather report. My opinions, not necessarily those of the Bank of New Zealand, who sponsors the economic weather report.